Alright, so in the previous tutorial we have seen how to handle these unhandled route errors, and now let's see how we can improve these error handling functionalities. For example, let's say how we can generalize these error invocations, because as I mentioned in the introduction, these errors could happen at anywhere. So we need to have a proper standard mechanism to handle those different errors in a more generic format. Otherwise, if we are going to address each and every error in a unique fashion, what will happen is that our code will be quite long, and sometimes it won't be readable as well, right? So it's a bad practice. So instead of that, what we can do is we can generalize these error handling mechanisms. Then whenever there will be an error invocation, our generalized functions will be handle that error in a more clean way. Right, so first thing I want to do is I need to define an error handling middleware explicitly, which means currently our error handling is only specific for this unhandled route scenario. But let's say there are errors in post controllers or post routes or models or whatever, then those errors needs to be gone through a middleware and generate the specific request back to the client or back to the developer or something like that. So in this scenario, I'm going to use a middleware function. So first I will show you how to use a middleware function, because I think in the previous video I have mentioned this is a middleware function, but you may not understand it correctly. But however, it's quite simple actually. You can define it like that. So let's say request response next, and I will simply make a log. Let's say this is a middleware function. Middleware function. Right. So now, whenever I invoke this request, it will go to this middleware function. But if I invoke it now, I don't think it will be called. Yeah, it won't be called because there is no response that is passed to this middleware function. Okay, so that's why this function wasn't invoked correctly. So what I can do is that basically I will create a complete error handling middleware function, and I will explain you how it happens. Yeah, so first thing we have to do is basically we need to construct an error object over here instead of directly passing this sort of a response. So this response will be invoked through this middleware, right? Which means instead of doing it over here like that, I will call that function, or I will call that response over here. And since we are going to handle an error, we can catch errors, middlewares like this. So error represent error parameter, request represent a request, and this is response, and next is basically a pointer to point next function that is need to be executed after this middleware function execution, right? Yeah, so that's what it is. And now, as I said before, we are going to generalize this error handling mechanism, which means this status code also can be different with respect to your use case. So let's say I'm going to make it as a variable. Let's say error dot status code, right? So this error dot status code can be defined like this. So it can be let's say the error status code passed using this error parameter, right? Or it can be a general 500 error, right? So if we haven't defined any sort of error code, what will happen is that error status code will be by default 500. Then likewise the error status and the error message can be defined. So error status also can be defined in the similar fashion. Let's say error.status, and let's define our error.status as the default one and the passed one. So this is the default error status, which means if there is no error status has been predefined, it will be automatically be an error. But if we have passed some sort of status through this error parameter, it will assigned as the error status. And the error message also can be defined like that, and let's say simply error.message, right? And error.message also goes like this, and the default one is basically, let's say something went wrong, right? So basically these are default parameters, which means if we haven't defined any sort of error specifications, it will be assigned by default these values. But if we assign some sort of, or if we pass some sort of values through these parameters, they will be override and generate a response back to the user, right? Now we need to call this function. So in order to call these functions, we must throw an error. So once error has been thrown, it will be passed back to this middleware function and it will be executed. So in order to pass an error, first we need to construct an error. So error object can be constructed by using default error constructor. So this is basically a generic constructor for generate Express related errors. So initially I will use this, but later on I will improve these constructors in a more flexible fashion, but for now this will be quite okay. And let's say our error is route is not defined or something like that, and our error.status is basically, let's say, fail, and our error.status code will be 404. Then once all of this stuff has been constructed, what it do is basically it needs to point to this middleware, right? Otherwise it doesn't know what to be executed next. So what I can do is basically I will use this next and passed error object through this next function. So next is a pointer to next function or next middleware function or whatever you want to say. Then this error will be assigned to this parameter and all of these values will be populated and it will generate this response and pass it back to the user, right? So that's how it happens. And now if I invoke this function, you can see our error message is displayed like this, as well as you can see in the console the middleware function has been called, right? Because we have point this next error to this middleware function. But in case if I haven't defined like this, for example, let's say if there is no next pointer, then whenever I invoke this function, it won't do anything because it doesn't know what to be executed next. Therefore, I need to explicitly say next is error handling middleware by passing this error parameter or error object as a parameter, right? So that's how we can improve our error handling, and in the next tutorial, let's see how we can handle in a more generic fashion these errors, right? And yeah, thank you.